When you dare to share, you break the silence. When you dare to share, you speak your truth. When you dare to share, you use the full strength of your voice. When you dare to share, it brings opportunity to own your story. So tell it, be heard, and at the same time, your sharing is someone else's learning, inspiration, motivation, empowerment, and hope. There's always an element to each of our stories that remains a secret. For some, we feel it's a dirty little secret. Dare to share your untold story exposes these secrets in a welcoming and positive way. I encourage each of you out there to dare yourself to share what is yours to tell. When we dare, it is the courage to do something really important. Let this be a vow to each and every single one of us that we take risk, we brave, confront, and face what is, while inspiring and empowering all communities. So let's break that silence and tap into mental beauty. This is Salima Jadavji, your podcast host, a practicing clinical social worker, and your mental wellness connoisseur. Welcome to the Dare to Share Your Untold Story podcast, episode number 6, a heroine's journey filled with grief, sadness, discovery, and resilience. To all my fellow listeners, before we get started, I'm just dropping in a note to give you a heads up that this podcast might be emotionally triggering for you. We do invite guests onto the show who share openly about extremely difficult life moments with exposure and impact of what the struggles have been like. The intensity of each episode could have a variable impact on your emotional and mental well-being based on your own personal story. If at any point the topic becomes uncomfortable or upsetting to you in any way, please do not pressure yourself to listen. Instead, be kind to yourself, do some self-care, and perhaps give another episode a try. It is with delight I introduce you to our guest, Gulshan Alibai. Gulshan has earned a master's in social work degree and has put this to excellent use as she has worked with diverse populations, including immigrants, refugees, and individuals struggling with various mental health issues. She currently teaches within the social work programs both at Wilfrid Laurier University and Seneca College. She is a mom of 2 boys who are 15 and 20 years old. After the sudden death of her husband in 2013, she took over her husband's iconic 400-seat restaurant known as Lahore Tikka House in the heart of Toronto's Little India. And by doing so, she has kept his dream alive of bringing the sense of community together. Hello, Gulshan. Welcome to the Dare to Share. Hello. Welcome to the Dare to Share Your Untold Story podcast. I really want to extend my gratitude to you for carving out the time to be part of this podcast during all of your busyness and showing your support for taking a stance to help break the barriers of mental stigma.
Thank you so much for having me, and it's such a pleasure to do this.
I'm so excited. I just can't wait for us to get started. Gulshan, as you know, this podcast is about bringing forward untold stories that people go through, whether directly about a mental health struggle or something else. And we know that no matter the story, there is impact on one's own mental health in some way, which remains tucked away. And so this platform serves as a way to break the barriers of mental stigma that have been conditioned in our society. So we are here really encouraging people to share and tell what individuals typically have reluctance for unveiling. So, Gulshan, I'm ready for this. Are you ready for the conversation?
I'm ready.
Excellent. Okay, so here we go. Give us the newspaper headline of how you would title your untold story. How would this headline read?
Grief is by far bittersweet.
Okay, grief is by far bittersweet. Can you tell me a little bit more about this title?
Well, it's really interesting because I worked at the Canadian Mental Health Association for 20 years, and what I did is a lot around mental health promotion and breaking stigma around mental illness and mental health. And I did a lot of workshops around stress and grieving and trauma to a lot of newcomer communities. But what was so interesting to me is as social workers, you often think that, you know, when you yourself are going through trauma and grief, that you have the tools and that you're invincible because you have, the knowledge base, you have the tools, and you're a social worker. So you should be able
Mm-hmm.
to get through this because
Mm-hmm.
you have that. And what I found out is that you are not immune just because you're a social worker.
Mm-hmm.
We all grapple with mental health issues. 1 in 4 people have mental health issues, and it's not, again, immune to social workers. So
Mm-hmm.
I went through my grief process and went through a lot of depression. And I had to, when I needed those resources and those skills, they failed, you know, and I
Right.
had to really learn that even service providers like ourselves, social workers, go through this, and we also experience mental health issues.
Of course. We're still human beings at the end of the day, right? So
Hmm.
we may have the skills to help people and, the training to do so. But when we're in our own circumstance faced with the same thing, we also need to seek the supports from other people as well.
Exactly.
Hmm. Your headline, the way you describe your headline really captivates the nuances and the depth of your experience from what I can tell is going to be a very interesting journey that you share. So let's segue into the telling of your story. Can you share what your untold story is all about?
Well, it all happened on November 6th, 2013, when my husband Ulner stated that he was kind of feeling some jaw pain
Mm-hmm.
and, just not feeling well. And so, we stated to him, maybe you need to go to the emergency room. Maybe there's something, that's hurting you. He goes, well, I just need to rest. And so gave him a glass of orange juice and said to him that I will take our son Adam to school.
Mm-hmm.
And, I don't know, about 5 minutes later, we had almost gotten onto the highway, and I told my son Adam, who was giving a ride to school, can you please call your dad and see if he's okay? So Adam called, and
Mm-hmm.
my husband didn't pick up the phone. And
Mm-hmm.
so we turned the car back around, came home. He was on the couch with his eyes
Mm-hmm.
closed.
Mm-hmm.
And we called out his name, and he wouldn't answer. And at that point, I ran to him and had to give him CPR.
Right.
He was having a massive heart attack. Um, we lost him, and my whole life turned from being married, working in my profession, to being a single mother now,
Mm-hmm.
having to run his restaurant,
Mm-hmm.
and having to grapple with his passing. And it happened within seconds.
Just seconds. It all changed in seconds.
Hmm.
And I'm sure with, having to take over the restaurant and raising the boys and going through everything that all happened, probably just in quick flashes, do you feel that you actually dealt with the grief or attempted to deal with the grief during that time? Or did it take a while before you got to the point of saying, okay, I think now I can deal with the grief?
That's an amazing question because I had thought that I had actually dealt with the grief. I remember maybe like about, everything was such a daze, right? For
Mm-hmm.
the first 3 months, it was such a daze. Like, I didn't know if I was coming or going,
Mm-hmm.
if it was night or day. I
Right.
was just on autopilot and on
Mm-hmm.
adrenaline.
Yeah.
And I don't even know how I was functioning, but I had to function. So that's where the cortisol levels, the adrenaline levels, everything had to be at 4. So it was actually a very crisis, trauma, somatic responses that was keeping me going. It was fight or flight at that point in time.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. The stress response was fully activated and you were in survival mode, right? You were just doing what you needed to do to keep afloat, it sounds like.
Exactly. And what's really interesting is that, often people think of trauma and grief being in one's head, right? In
Mm-hmm.
terms of just emotion, but people
Mm-hmm.
don't really understand what kind of physical toll it also takes on you.
Mm-hmm.
Often that's where it shows up because sometimes you don't even have the words to express the emotions that you're feeling. And
Yeah.
sometimes it is a positive thing because you would never be able to cope with those emotions. So I think
Mm-hmm.
what happens is the body takes it on, right?
Mm-hmm.
And
Mm-hmm.
physically, the body's taking it on. And the reason why the body sometimes physically needs to take it on is that the body will show up symptoms So then you're able to see those symptoms as red alerts that something's got to give. And that's what happened to me. It showed up physically. Chronic muscle spasms.
Mm-hmm.
My blood pressure went skyrocket high. I had to get on blood pressure medication.
Mm-hmm.
My thyroid completely went out of whack.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a real big connection between thyroid and anxiety,
Mm-hmm.
blood pressure, and just stress, as we probably know.
Mm-hmm.
And the muscle spasms was really housing the emotional pain.
Yeah, I mean, the body's telling you in so many ways. It's crying for help. It's like you're not able to pay attention to these subtle things that I'm nudging at you. So here, I'm going to give you something else to sort of get your attention. It's like, hi, I'm over here.
Exactly. And I think people often miss that, the actual somatic,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
what happens somatically to one in terms of showing up physically. And
Mm-hmm.
so this was like probably 2 years from the time that Elner passed away, my husband,
Mm-hmm.
to
Mm-hmm.
where my body just went completely wacko, like everything, like it was out of equilibrium. And I had to kind of just take a look then at the emotional pain
Mm-hmm.
and the depression and the anxiety, right? That happened.
Right.
And so then I started having to really look at my own health, my physical health. And as I
Mm-hmm.
was going through that process, I had to start dealing with the emotional stuff. So what I could say now is it's been 7 years,
Mm-hmm.
and there's, three categories of grief. There's a chronic grief
Mm-hmm.
reaction,
Mm-hmm.
the gradual recovery, and the
Mm-hmm.
resilient response. And I
Yep.
have to say that I have probably kind of gone through all three categories. You're supposed
Mm-hmm.
to kind of go through one, but
Mm-hmm.
I think that's the biggest critique around all the grief work is people just think it's supposed to be linear, and it's not linear. It's very, very
It has ebbs and flows.
mhm.
I can't imagine how it would be linear because it's not a cookie cutter way of like responding to grief. Like each person's experience is subjective and individual. And so the way you treat it and deal with will also be subjective and individualized.
So well said. And in regards to even like, like if you look at some cultures like in Bali and places like that, when an
Mhm.
individual passes away, you're
Mhm.
supposed to just remain calm. You're
Yeah.
not supposed to show emotion, right? And in
Mhm.
other cultures, you're supposed to show a lot of emotion, right? So it's
Mhm.
so culturally subjective as well. I was studying about one culture in South America where when an infant passes away, you're not
Mhm.
supposed to grieve because that child has come as an angel and doesn't need to go through pain and any type of pain in their lives. And the mother is not supposed to cry for that infant that just passed away because it's an angel. So there's so many ways that grief is acceptable, it's not acceptable,
Mhm.
just different ways of people looking at grief. So you're absolutely right about that. So when I kind of went through this process of grief, I kind of thought it was the Kubler-Ross, the 5 stages of grief.
Mhm.
And what I
Mhm.
really found out that it's not. Grief is universal. We're all going to die. We're all going to go through grief. Everyone's going to go through grief
Mhm.
at some point in their lives. Everyone's lost something. But the
Mhm.
way that we actually go through the process is very, very unique and subjective, as you said. So for me right now, it's been about 7 years, and I think I'm at that area where I can call it resilient grief.
Yeah. Right. When you talked about how, you're supposed, with the people who write the theories, I mean, it makes sense that maybe some people will gravitate to one style of grief than the other. But I think it's limiting when we know that, there could be a combination. Maybe someone else will have, experienced the chronic and the resilience, but not the one in between.
Exactly.
Mm-hmm.
Exactly.
Right.
Yeah. So right now I'm in that whole, I kind of look at it like there's a hero's journey by Joseph Campbell, and then there's also a heroine journey. And
Mm-hmm.
I really see the trauma and the grief that I have experienced. It's really brought me to this whole area of growth, right? Resilient growth.
Mm-hmm.
And with the heroine's journey, it really talks about a very circular kind of thing. Like you're kind of born to be whole. And then because of
Mm-hmm.
socialization, culturalization, and all of the patriarchy, things completely you go through all these different stages and then you can become whole again. And I think
Mm-hmm.
through this whole journey of going through grief and loss and trauma and
Mm-hmm.
depression, it's really kind of brought me to be whole, and resilience is kind of where I'm
Mm-hmm.
at. And even if you look at Warden's task of
Mm-hmm.
mourning, there's the fourth stage. There's the accept the reality of the loss, work through the pain of the grief,
Mm-hmm.
adjust to an environment in which the deceased is missing, and
Mm-hmm.
find an enduring connection with the deceased while embarking on a new life. I
Mm-hmm.
think I'm at that stage. I'm at now kind of stage 4. But what I've
Right.
also found is that you can easily go back into stage 1 again. So it's not, again, linear. It could be
Right.
very cyclical and it could be very dialectical. And
Yes.
that's why I would say it would be bittersweet, because the stages are not in chronological order, but the
Mm-hmm.
stages are more dialectical. They're more circular.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And so the post traumatic growth that you talk about, this is very much more of a recent, like, resilience application, right? And I guess my understanding of post traumatic growth is, it's the benefit of positive finding. And it occurs after someone experiences adversity or challenge. And the result is when you see the big impact on the psychological level for the better and getting to a greater level of functioning. Can you say a little bit more about how you sort of were able to switch gears?
Well, definitely it was through a lot of the dark night of the soul, I would have
Mm-hmm.
to say, where I just, the pain was so immense that
Mm-hmm.
I knew that if I didn't do the hard work and really feel
Mm-hmm.
the pain
Mm-hmm.
and sit with it, like one does when they go through, post traumatic stress, and really kind of
Mm-hmm.
sitting with the actual pain to be able to kind of get through it. I had to do that, because if I didn't, I was sinking.
Mm-hmm. So you were very much engaging with what was occurring and what was being experienced rather than trying to like block it out.
Right, because I told you, like, after I went through the whole
Mm-hmm.
in terms of how the grief actually affected me physically. I
Right.
had no other choice but to deal with it emotionally, because I knew that the only way that I could get better physically is if I
Mm-hmm.
dealt with the emotions.
Well, Gulshan, you still had a choice, but you chose the better option, right? I guess that the physical toll was your wake up call that
Yes.
it's time. It's time that I deal. So the motivation, the driving force was there,
Hmm.
and that maybe got activated a little bit more for you.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah, so I had to take the journey, and it was a
Mm-hmm.
very painful journey, as
Mm-hmm.
grief usually, is painful, but at the end, there is so much, like we're just talking about right now, this psychological growth. Like it's almost like I built an extra layer of skin with that resilience, right?
Mm-hmm.
And what I think has been really empowering for me is, as a social worker, we often think that empathy is just something that's inborn in helping professionals. We talk
Mm-hmm.
a lot about empathy, right? And positive
Mm-hmm.
regard. But I will
Right.
tell you that I really believe now that one has to go through that journey to really be an effective helper. For me, I mean, not maybe for everyone, but for me as a social worker, I think it's made me a better mental health worker, because I've gone through that pain, right? And I can really
Right.
have that genuine empathy
Mm-hmm.
again, for me, for myself, as a helping professional.
Yeah, the pain shaped you, and
Yeah.
perhaps because this is something that happened at a point where you were not at the start of your career either, you're able to look at yourself reflecting back without this experience, without this grief experience, how you perceived the world and how you sort of engaged with it. And you probably see a difference now.
Yes, totally. And I see that in terms of how I engaged with people. I mean, before it
Mm-hmm.
used to be kind of very surfacey kind of thing when I would
Mm-hmm.
help somebody, but now
Mm-hmm.
it comes from a deep, deep, deep
Yeah.
place of
Mm-hmm.
really kind of having, all I can say is that empathy is so real for me now, right?
Yeah, you talk about the dark night of the souls, and there was another guest that came on the show that also talked about the dark night of the soul. And when you were talking just now about going surfacey, where you might have been more surface level before, I feel like when my experience of people who talk about their dark night of the soul and going through that it's like there's no fear to kind of keep going inward and digging more and more. So if you're in the helping profession and you're seeing where someone is at, you're not scared of their journey. You're really there by their side. So it's very easy to go to help them dig deeper and get to the core.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. So much more with, going through this experience.
Yeah, and it sounds like that's what you were describing.
Right. And the resilience, like the growth, right? Like I
Mm-hmm.
feel whole. Like when I was talking about the heroine's journey,
Yes,
I feel
yes.
like I had to go through the deep night of soul to be able to be whole again. And
Mm-hmm.
I think it's again, I know it's a cliche, but just really coming back to your authentic self
Mm-hmm.
and really being able to not defy people's expectations of you socially, culturally, religiously,
Mm-hmm.
right? And where it kind of makes you, I've been through this journey, I have gone
Mm-hmm.
through the pain. You cannot define me through your cultural, social, and religious lens.
Mm-hmm.
I've become whole and coming
Mm-hmm.
back to my authentic self. And I think for me, it's just my connection with my spirituality,
Mm-hmm.
which has become so much more vivid and so much more deep and so much more insightful
Mm-hmm.
through this journey. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. It sounds like all of the things that you're talking about really exemplify what you're really grateful for in terms of going through this journey, being able to become whole again. That yes, you went through that dark night of the soul and it was painful and sometimes probably very draining and exhausting. But it sounds like by sticking it through, that feeling of wholeness is something that you know that you haven't experienced before, and you're very grateful for all that's come with it.
Hmm. Hmm. And I think, just in terms of even the direction that I took, being a mental health worker and working within a very medical model type of organization and
Mm-hmm.
working within that certain lens, I was really kind of applauded myself because I actually took an alternative healing approach rather than the medical model. And what I mean by that is there is a place for medication and pharmacological therapies. And,
Mm-hmm.
some people do need that, right? To be able
Mm-hmm.
to get to, from baseline to step one, right? And
Mm-hmm.
I'm not knocking that down. But for me, I felt that I needed to take more of an alternative holistic journey. So
Mm-hmm.
I actually found an energy healer who I give so much to because I didn't need to take the antipsychotic, antidepressants, anti-anxiety medications.
Mm-hmm.
The energy work really worked with my chakras
Mm-hmm.
and was really being able to kind of balance me and really help me through my stress and my depression and my anxiety. And
Mm-hmm.
then I also started working with a lot of women's circles
Mm-hmm.
around really looking at the feminine divine energies and really tapped
Mm-hmm.
into that for a lot of my strength in terms of really kind of connecting to the goddess energies to really make me
Mm-hmm.
feel empowered. And then I did a lot of work around spirituality, around death and dying from very a mystical kind of perspective, reading the great poets like Hafiz and Rumi and the Buddha.
Mm-hmm.
And those were things that really kind of helped, again, exercise. That was huge, and
Right.
so it was actually the more, I hate calling it alternative, but that's
Mm-hmm.
kind of what they call it in the field. But I think it's really important to integrate,
Yeah.
healing approaches rather than just looking at the medical model.
Right. And, it really sounds that you taking this holistic approach really has been your driving force in your healing journey, the way you've been sharing with us. And, it's like you're telling me in this conversation that, this is the approach that helped me deal with my internal storms. And, that's how you kept your restaurant alive and it helped keep you going. And then, you felt connected to things that were familiar to you, even if you were not sure how you were keeping afloat at some times, right?
Hmm. Hmm.
And I think it's important, as you were saying, is to really highlight the benefits of taking the holistic approach, because in the holistic approach, you're treating the whole person instead of just the problem or the specific need, right? So, the approach encompasses, as you were telling just now, all parts of the person, right? So the physical, the emotional, the social, and the spiritual well-being. And you're looking from the lens of regaining wellness rather than just focusing on the illness lens or the situation or the condition. And so, yes, even working in the medical model, it's also hard to step into a different direction and try something that's not the norm for what you normally do.
Hmm. Hmm.
I guess when you're working with an organization that follows the medical model, even though you may have your own practice, sometimes it's hard to keep those two things clear.
Mm-hmm.
And knowing your boundaries within the profession, and then knowing that even as in personal, hey, this is what I can do differently, that adds a compliment. So Gulshan, given everything that we've discussed so far in terms of your journey and the impacts and the tellings of, some of the turmoil, everything that's happened, what part of the journey would you say that you're in for yourself? Do you feel that you're looking back, in the middle, or getting started?
That's an amazing question. And I think from where I am right now, I think I'm really kind of now, how do I, okay, so it's really interesting because when I look at death,
Mm-hmm.
I don't look at it as the person is gone, right?
Mm-hmm.
How I've been able to kind of really cope with Eleanor's passing, my father's passing, my grandmother's passing is really that it's so part of me that I think what really helped me is understanding that they're not gone,
Mm-hmm.
right? So it's almost a paradox kind of thing. It's like they're
Mm-hmm.
not gone. And I really believe that they're here with me. And I'll kind of explain to you what I mean by that.
Okay.
Um, I had no experience running a restaurant. I mean, I'm a social worker, worked at a mental
Mm-hmm.
health agency for 20 years,
Right. Right.
and and I had to take over my husband's restaurant.
Mm-hmm.
As I said, I'm not an entrepreneur,
Mm-hmm.
right? But I felt like his presence with me at the restaurant. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
for example, things that I was trying to find and I couldn't find, and all of a sudden it would appear. I have to say magically, you
Mm-hmm.
know, how do I handle a situation? And if I really kind of looked at my sixth sense, messages would come, right?
Right.
People would also even say to me, they felt his presence there. Customers who walked in there would say, we still feel him here, you know?
Wow.
And I
Yeah.
really feel that that actually helped me so much deal with the grief, knowing that he wasn't gone, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I think what's happening in our Western kind of medical model
Mm-hmm.
is that we kind of say when someone dies, they're gone, right? And I really think we need to kind of re-examine that. They're
Mm-hmm.
not. I think they've just kind of passed over. And I look at very spiritually that they're there. And they
Mm-hmm.
are guiding us and they're around us, right? Because we do need them during our grief period, right?
Right.
So I really took a lot of comfort in that. And I know that a lot of people kind of looked at me very strangely for kind of talking about it in that regard. But I really believe that we need to really, again, reflect on how somebody is passing. They're not dead, you know? And
It's a
and I know,
reframe,
yeah,
right? It's a
exactly.
reframe. So they're not with
Yeah,
us physically. We don't get
right.
to see them on a physical level, but there's so many other parts of them that still keep going.
Exactly. And I think that's what's given me comfort today. And
Mm-hmm.
at that point in time, and I still believe my husband is still somewhere part of that restaurant. And
Mm-hmm.
there were times where I'm like, I can't do this restaurant anymore. I can't deal with this anymore. This is just way too much work. And
Mm-hmm.
I actually had a lot of individuals coming to me and wanting to buy the property that the restaurant is housed in.
Mm-hmm.
And, when I would see a bulldozer kind of going through the place, converting
Mm-hmm.
it into some kind of other, something else, I couldn't do it. And
Mm-hmm.
so I know that it's because I feel it's almost like a legacy. It's almost like the Taj Mahal,
Right.
where it's a mausoleum,
Mm-hmm.
and the spirit of the individual is still there. That's kind of how I look at the Hortica House and the restaurant. That I'm not ready to let it go, and that doesn't mean that I'm not. Oh, I'm still kind of going through the grief process, and I'm probably at that place where I'm finding and enduring a connection with the passing of my husband while still
Mm-hmm.
embarking on a new life. So it's almost like balancing it in a way. Like I'm
Yeah, like
I'm ready.
you're
Hmm.
looking back to a certain extent, right? Like you've made peace, you've come to terms. There's a whole resilience piece that's shown up where you can actually be present and grounded in life today. And because you're in that place, you're now sort of venturing off somewhere else.
Exactly. I love how you express that because it's exactly kind of what I'm feeling. It's like again the bittersweet, right?
Mm-hmm.
Where yes, the sweetness is that I went through this whole journey and I came out so much more stronger and so resilient
Mm-hmm.
and dealt with the pain and kind of going through the grief. But the bitter part is that I still cannot not let go of his legacy, and
Mm-hmm.
I may never be able to let go of that legacy, right?
Well, it's
And it
really
might,
too, yeah, it's too
yeah,
close to your heart right now. It feels
yeah.
like when you talk about that bulldozer, like to me,
Hmm.
it feels like,
Hmm.
oh, that would go right through your heart, if that,
Exactly. And
right.
so, I think grief is such a thing that, people want it to be like, okay, it's 7 years. You need to just get over this and move on with the grief. But I don't think you
Mm-hmm.
really move on. I think it's with you. It's part of your scars, right? And I
Yeah.
think that's how we need to kind of look at grief, because I think that's why it gets so difficult, because in terms of how we've been conditioned and socialized, you're supposed to move on, right? It's always about moving on. But sometimes, again, the bittersweetness is that you never really do move on. It just adds, there's a scar, and it
Mm-hmm.
heals, but the scar is still there and it's with you.
Yeah, and it's kind of like the way I see what you're saying is moving on versus moving through it, and
Mhm.
moving through with what you take with you,
Mhm. Mhm.
So you don't have to take everything, but there's certain parts that you definitely do take with you.
Mhm. Exactly. And then that's kind of how I look at it now. And when I do work and I do teach,
Hmm.
it's not that, like, if you loved, then you're going to grieve, right? And you're going to
Hmm.
through that, and you can take it back to like the whole attachment theory, right?
Hmm.
That it's part of that. Like, if you do attach, you do mourn, right?
Right.
And you do go through grief. And like you were saying, it's part of the existence, right? Like,
Hmm.
yeah.
It really amazes me when you talk about the place of, your experience of spiritual growth and how you have this ability to detach. At the same time, you go inward and reflect on your own experiences, and you sort of embrace all parts of everything.
Hmm.
And the way you tell it, and all the different parts and all of the theories and learnings and shared experiences that you have with connecting with other people and how you talk about it, it's just really amazing to hear how each step sort of led to the next one.
Yeah. And, thank you for saying that. And, just having me reflect on what you just said. But yes, definitely, you know, before these experiences of loss, like, it was so textbook for me, right? It was so textbook. This is how you're supposed to go through grief. This is how you're
Right.
supposed to go through loss. This is how you're supposed to go through trauma.
Right.
But, now as a social worker and a helping professional, that's kind of been so, like, I had to go through that, just in terms of having me being able to really have, again, going back to that empathy from my own
Mm-hmm.
clients, right?
Mm-hmm.
And really getting that message that it's not linear and it's so subjective,
Mm-hmm.
and you need to sometimes throw the textbook away.
Yeah. Throw the textbook
Hmm.
away. I like that.
Hmm.
um, so, you talked about the socialization of grief. It's come up a couple times in our conversation.
Hmm.
And we've talked about, the individualized experience of grief. It does look so different for each person. Now, looking at your family unit, did you find that it was hard to grieve together?
Oh, definitely. And my boys were 8 and 12 when they lost their father.
Hmm. Such a tender
Yeah,
time.
exactly. And you know what? Being a social worker again, I would like, you guys need to talk about the grief, and we need to express the grief.
Right.
And they didn't want anything to do with it.
Hmm.
And the thing is, all of us grieved so differently, and we grieved separately. And
Yeah.
to this day, it's been 7 years,
Hmm.
and my son still will not. I don't think he's dealt with the grief. I think it's very much, as we often say, unresolved, right?
Yeah.
It's like, I don't think he's accepted the reality of the loss or worked through his pain.
Right.
And he's 20 now. And with my younger son, who's 15, he
Hmm.
was 8 years old when his father passed away. Yeah. And, I have, like, the restaurant is a legacy to my husband. There's pictures of him everywhere.
Hmm.
When people come in, it's like his restaurant. They'll see a huge picture of him when they walk in. I still can't claim it as mine. And with the boys, I mean, in my house as well, there's pictures
Hmm.
of Ulner everywhere,
Hmm.
of my father. Like, it's almost like, again, a mausoleum. But
Hmm.
I feel like, to them, they don't want to talk about it. They don't want to acknowledge it. It's just there. So I don't know. I mean, for me, I feel it might be
Hmm.
another, when they have their own kids, or they haven't really, I don't feel like they've really gone through the process. And that's why
Right.
I think for them, it's the gradual recovery. It's gradual.
Right.
Yeah.
And I do find that this is a large way in how people do cope with grief. Like, I was curious because you are a tight family unit. I was curious to see, if there was a component of how you may have grieved together. But it is typically, not typically, but I would still say frequently what I see that happens in the therapy room with the intimate stories that are shared with me and seeing how even people in my own community cope and elsewhere is that they find ways to grieve, but maybe not together. And, some things that I can note is that, I find people have a tough time freely showing their emotion to other family members. And I'm sure that there's like many different reasons that come along, but some of the ones that really stand out for me when people talk about grief with me is that, sometimes it stems from being judged or even the self-judgment, like, as you were talking about in terms of how to grieve and should I be speaking or not speaking, so this idea to be able to grieve freely and not only with the judgments, but there's also this guilt-free idea, right? So that there's many people who don't want their loved ones to know how they really are feeling because, oh, well, if I tell them, then they might really be worried about me. Or, that idea that, well, they're going through all of their own emotions, so I don't want to bother anyone or burden them. So it's this idea of protecting one another. That's a really big theme that I see as well. So the whole idea of judgment, whether it's judgment from others or self-judgment, and the self-judgment can also be part of like the whole belief system and the cultural values or societal norms, right? That kind of guide people to become a certain way. But I do find that it's really interesting that it all does come back to keeping silent, not sharing, and recognizing that there's so much more healing that occurs when we take what seems to be the risk to share, and then how much relief and grounding comes with it. So, like your process,
Yeah.
you have led by example.
Right. But I also have found from this whole thing that, again, it comes back to being able to kind of hold space for my two sons, right?
Yes.
And me holding space for them really means to me kind of respecting that they don't want to deal with it, or
Yep.
maybe they are dealing with it, or whatever. Because again, it's so individual,
It
right?
is. Mm-hmm.
And I've probably been shaped more by who I am as a helping professional,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Mm-hmm.
Understanding it, but I have to really hold space for them, and I have to respect, that they don't want to go near it, and maybe they will, and maybe they never will.
Yeah, and it's their journey, right? And it's all
Yeah.
about this whole concept, this judgment that we talked about, right? So like with society, there's judgment that's placed directly or indirectly on how to
Mhm.
grieve. And if
Mhm.
you're doing
Mhm.
it right or doing it enough or not enough, having feelings, not having enough feelings,
Mhm.
looking composed, or are you looking disheveled or
Mhm.
discombobulated?
Mhm.
It's like, which one are you? And I don't know
Mhm.
that you necessarily have to be in any particular category, and you can bounce around.
I love that. And I think that's where the education really needs to happen, right? Like, I think
Mm-hmm.
this is where we as social workers and mental health workers really need to be able to have people understand that grief has so many different facets to it, right? And
Mm-hmm.
when we talk about depression, like depression, you're supposed to have the sadness and you're supposed to have crying and you need to, the sleeping change. Like, it's so DSM, 6,
Right.
and I think that really needs to change. And I think, a lot of education needs to be done around that,
Mm-hmm.
because it's not all like the DSM-6, right?
It's not just a diagnosis, right?
Yeah,
It's
yeah.
it's beyond that. I'm really intrigued about how you've talked about sorting through all of this, and it also sounds like the
Mm-hmm.
understanding and accepting the learning that there isn't a timeline for grief.
Mm-hmm.
You did mention that, and you know, you talked about keeping the building alive means keeping my husband alive in some
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
sense, right? And, if I didn't keep the restaurant alive, then, maybe it would feel like a bulldozer through my heart, like that whole idea.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I think you're right. Like, there's no timeline for grief. And I've had people say, well, it's been 6 months. How come I can't snap out of this? I'm
Yeah.
like, it's not something you snap out of. It's something you work through
Mm-hmm.
and move through, right? So
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
it's so important that you've shared your story today because I'm hoping that it's helped people piece some of their grief puzzle together. And so, on that note, I wanted to sort of ask you, what is your key message to the listeners of the show? Anything that you feel is important for them to know?
I think really, it's really kind of, having compassion for yourself and having compassion for your loss, right? Like I think often we're so hard on ourselves and we think that we need to like
Mm-hmm.
get through this, and we need to kind of go with other people's expectations and how
Mm-hmm.
grief should look, feel, whatever. But I think,
Mm-hmm.
you need to have compassion for yourself, and you need to be able to have compassion for your loss, right? And
Mm-hmm.
I think we often don't have enough of that for ourselves. We need to be strong. We need to just get over it, right? And like you said,
Mm-hmm.
snap out of it.
Yeah.
No,
It's a process.
it's a process, but it's
Yeah.
you need to have compassion in that
Yes.
process.
Yes. Mm-hmm. Any other message that you think is important for anyone to know who might be experiencing grief of a loved one, grief or loss of a loved one?
I think the main thing for me is just, you know, if you need that comfort to know that, like you said earlier, Salima, that if, physically they may not be there, but
Mm-hmm.
they are there with you spiritually. And if that
Mm-hmm.
gives you comfort, do not shy away from that, because other people may think that when they're gone, they're gone. That's
Mm-hmm.
there. But if it brings you comfort to know that they're still here with you,
Mm-hmm.
then don't be ashamed of that. And don't be ashamed of expressing that.
Right. That's amazing. It sounds like so clear the way you've put it.
Mm-hmm.
It really does
Mm-hmm.
sound really, really clear. So the thing I just started to think about, I know we talked about this earlier, and you were just mentioning, Kubler-Ross's 5 stages of grief,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
right? And, denial, anger, bargaining, depression, acceptance, that those are her stages, right? And you mentioned how, maybe it's more than acceptance. There's more that happens. And
Mm-hmm.
I know there are some other frameworks, and you've mentioned a few. And I don't know the framework that I'm
Mm-hmm.
talking about that's coming to mind, but there's these added elements that I think would really help people in terms of understanding their grief. So there's this whole idea of maybe even before denial, it's just the shock
Mm-hmm.
and the pain,
Mm-hmm.
right? That goes along with it, that
Mm-hmm.
might actually happen before the denial.
Mm-hmm.
And then somewhere in there, I think that there's this guilt and reconstruction and working through before you get to acceptance,
Yes, I totally agree. And there's this
right?
whole area right now of how there's, when you look at trauma and when you look at
Mm-hmm.
grief, it's like intersections of that, right?
Yeah, it's a
And
parallel process almost.
exactly. So you're right. You're talking about the actual crisis, like the crisis, the shock,
Mm-hmm.
that
Mm-hmm.
one goes through. And I don't think you can separate both grief and trauma. Like it's so interwoven.
Yeah, because when you say it that way, no matter if I've worked with people whose grief is like when they've had a loved one who's been ill for a while, maybe from the outside in, you'll say, well, it was a long time coming, or the person who's had a sudden loss. I don't think it matters because the shock is the
Exactly.
shock. Because if your loved one, if your heart connection, whomever that person is unwell, you are present with them until the unfortunate passing occurs,
Exactly.
and you're there, and you're putting your feelings aside, and you're doing everything you can to support them.
Exactly.
And so you're not necessarily prepared in any other way.
Exactly. And I do see it as like trauma. There's so many overlaps with the whole trauma response, right? And again,
Mhm.
again, that goes into that whole area when I was sharing with you
Mhm.
about how my body actually, it was physical, right?
Mhm.
And with trauma, that's what we often see is the whole with PTSD, post traumatic stress, we often
Mhm.
see it kind of really getting into the physical symptoms, right?
Mhm.
And I
Mhm.
really see grief like that as well,
Mhm.
that it's overlaps with trauma.
Right. So, Gulshan, as we come closer to the end, I just wanted to ask, what is a cause or an organization that has been impactful to you on your journey that you would like to give a shout out to?
I think for me, two huge people that have really supported and organizations that really supported me is Clarity Barton
Mhm.
from the Awakened Priestess. I've been doing a lot of her
Mhm.
Heroine's journey work with really connecting to the feminine goddesses and really kind of bringing their energy in.
Mhm.
And the other one I have to say is Mina Shah, who
Mhm.
has done amazing work with me around energy work.
Mhm.
And I have to say, it's those two different modalities and those two different groups and individuals that have really kept me being able to really work through my grief.
Wow, that sounds like you have some really great people on your side.
Hmm. Hmm.
So, how can people connect with you? If there's someone who wants to connect with you, perhaps they feel they need to connect with you in some way personally, your story maybe relates to them. Would you be okay with people connecting to you? And if so, how can they reach out to you?
Oh, yes. I would love to kind of share again my story and help, individuals and provide support through this journey. Yes, you can definitely contact me through my email, which is GulshanAlibhai @gmail.com. So it's Gulshi Alibai @gmail.com.
Awesome. Gulshan, this was such a touching and important conversation. Thank you for sharing fully without holding back and letting your voice lead the way from where it began all the way to where you are now.
I just wanted to thank you so much, Salima, for giving me the opportunity to tell my story and how you've really created a beautiful platform for people to help one another. So I really applaud you for the work that you're doing.
Thank you. It's my pleasure. And again, thank you for being part of Dare to Share Your Untold Story and helping to be a voice in breaking down the barriers of mental stigma. We're so happy to have you here.
Thank you again.
I'm really hopeful that this will help, the story that you've shared today will also help others come forward to tell a story of their own. I'm hoping that we can keep this moving forward. To all of our listeners, if you like what you've been hearing on this podcast and you want to be part of breaking down barriers of mental stigma, I invite you to go wherever you are listening to the episode and hit subscribe. Leave us a comment or a review of the episode and maybe how you relate to it. To learn more about what we offer, visit www.daretoheal.co. And if you are feeling ready and brave to share, please submit your story by visiting www.daretoshare.co. Thanks for joining in.